Danny, my father said. Yes, Dad? I've been wondering how a bird manages to keep its balance, sitting on a branch when it's asleep. I don't know. Why? It's very peculiar. What's peculiar? It's peculiar that a bird doesn't topple off its perch as soon as it goes to sleep. After all, if we were sitting on a branch and we went to sleep, we would fall off at once, wouldn't we? Birds have claws and long toes, Dad. I expect they hold on with those. I know that, Danny, but I still don't understand why the toes keep gripping the perch once the bird is asleep. I waited for him to go on. I was just thinking, he said, that if a bird can keep its balance when it's asleep, then surely there isn't any reason why the pills should make it fall down. It's doped. Surely it'll fall down if it's doped. But isn't that simply a deeper sort of sleep? There was a gloomy silence. I should have tested it with roosters, my father added. Suddenly the blood seemed to have drained right out of his cheeks. My dad would have tested it with roosters before he did anything else. At that moment, there came a soft thump from the wood behind us. What was that? I asked. Shh. We stood listening. Thump. There's another, I said. It was a deep, muffled sound, as though a bag of sand had been dropped to the ground. Thump. They're pheasants, I cried. Wait, they must be pheasants, Dad. Thump. Thump. You may be right, Danny. We switched on our torches and ran towards the sounds. Where are they? My father said. Over here, Dad. 2 of them were over here. I thought they were this way. Keep looking, they can't be far. We searched for about a minute. Here's one, my father called. When I got to him, he was holding a magnificent cock bird in both hands. We examined it closely with our torches. It's doped to high heaven, my father said. It won't wake up for a week. Thump. There's another, I cried. Thump. Thump. 2 more, my father yelled. Thump. 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 Jeepers, my father said. Thump. 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 All around us the pheasants were starting to rain down out of the trees. We began rushing round madly in the dark, sweeping the ground with our torches. Thump! 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 This lot fell almost on top of me. I was right under the tree as they came down, and I found all 3 of them immediately, 2 cocks and a hen. Where shall I put them, Dad? Lay them here, Danny. My father was standing on the edge of the clearing, with the moonlight streaming down all over him, and a great bunch of pheasants in each hand. His face was bright, his eyes big and bright and wonderful, and he was staring around him like a child who has just discovered that the whole world is made of chocolate. Thump! 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 It's too many, I cried. It's beautiful, he cried. Thump! 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 It was easy to find them now. I quickly collected 6 more, 3 in each hand, and ran back and dumped them with the others. And still they kept falling. My father was in a whirl of excitement now. Thump! 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 Hey, Danny! I'm over here. What is it, Dad? What do you think the great Mr. Victor Hazel would say if he could see this? Don't talk about it, I said. For 3 or 4 minutes the pheasants kept on falling. Then, suddenly, they stopped. Keep searching, my father shouted. There's plenty more on the ground. Dad, don't you think we ought to get out while the going's good? Never! Not on your life! We went on searching. Between us, we looked under every tree within 100 yards of the clearing, north, south, east, and west, and I think we found most of them in the end. At the collecting point, there was a pile of pheasants as big as a bonfire. It's a miracle, my father was saying. It's an absolute miracle. Shouldn't we just take about 6 each and get out quick? I'd like to count them, Danny. Dad, not now. I must count them. Can't we do that later? 1, 2, 3, 4... He began counting them very carefully, picking up each bird in turn and laying it bravely to one side. The moon was directly overhead now, and the whole clearing was brilliantly lit up. I felt as though I was standing in the glare of powerful headlamps. 117, 118, 119, 120, he cried. It's an all-time record. He looked happier than I'd ever seen him in his life. The most my dad ever got was 15, and he was drunk for a week afterwards. And you did it, Daddy. The whole thing was your idea in the first place. I didn't do it, Dad. Oh, yes, you did. And do you know what that makes you, my dear boy? It makes you the champion of the world. He pulled up his sweater and unwound the 2 big cotton sacks from round his belly. Here's yours, he said, handing one of them to me. Fill it up quick. We started loading pheasants into the sacks. They were soft and floppy-necked, and the skin underneath the feathers was still warm. We can't possibly carry this lot all the way home, I said. Of course not. There'll be a taxi waiting for us on the track outside the wood. A taxi? My dad always made use of a taxi on a big job. Why a taxi, for heaven's sake? It's more secret, Danny. Nobody knows who's inside a taxi except the driver. Which driver? Charlie Kinch. He's only too glad to oblige. Does he know about poaching too? Oh, Charlie Kinch? Of course he does. He's poached more pheasants in his time than we've sold gallons of petrol. We finished loading the sacks, and my father humped his onto his shoulders. I couldn't do that with mine. Drag it, my father said. Just drag it along the ground. My sack had 60 birds inside it, and it weighed a ton. But it slid quite easily over the dry leaves, with me walking backwards and pulling it with both hands. We came to the edge of the wood and peered through the hedge onto the track. My father said, "Charlie boy," very softly, and the old man behind the wheel of the taxi poked his head out into the moonlight and gave us a sly, toothless grin. We slid through the hedge, dragging the sacks after us along the ground. 2 minutes later, we were safely inside the taxi and cruising slowly down the bumpy track towards the road. My father was bursting with pride and excitement. He kept leaning forward and tapping Charlie Kinch on the shoulder and saying, "How about it, Charlie? How about this for a haul?" And Charlie kept glancing back pop-eyed at the huge bulging sacks. "Cripes, man," he kept saying. "How did you do it?" "Danny did it. My son Danny is the champion of the world." Then Charlie said, "I reckon pheasants is going to be a bit scarce up at Mr. Victor Hazel's opening day shoot tomorrow. Hey, Willem?" "I imagine they are, Charlie. I imagine they are." "All those fancy folk," old Charlie said, "driving in from miles around in their big shiny cars, and there won't be a blinking bird anywhere for them to shoot." Charlie Kinch started chuckling and chortling so much he nearly drove off the track. "Dad, what on earth are you going to do with all these pheasants?" "Share them out among our friends. There's a dozen of them for Charlie here to start with. All right, Charlie?" "Ha, that suits me." "Then there'll be a dozen for Doc Spencer, and another dozen for Enoch Samways." "You don't mean Sergeant Samways?" I gasped. "Of course," my father said. "Enoch Samways is one of my very oldest friends." "Enoch's a good boy," Charlie Kinch said. "He's a lovely lad." "Are you going to share them out tonight, Dad?" "Not tonight, Danny, no. You must always walk home empty-handed after a poaching trip. You can never be sure Mr. Rabbit or one of his gang isn't waiting for you by the front door to see if you're carrying anything." But he's a crafty one, that Mr. Rabbit is," Charlie Kinch said. "The best thing is to pour a pound of sugar in the petrol tank of his car when he ain't looking. Then he can't ever come snooping round your house later on. We always made sure to give the keepers a little sugar in their tanks before we went out on a poach." "What does the sugar do?" I asked. "Blimey, it gums up the already works," Charlie Kinch said. "You got to take the entire engine to pieces before it'll go again after it's had the sugar. Isn't that right, Willem?" "That's quite right, Charlie," my father said. We came off the bumpy track onto the main road, and Charlie Kinch got the old taxi into top gear and headed for the village. "Are you dumping these birds at Mrs. Clipstone's place tonight?" he asked. "Yes," my father told him. "Drive straight to Mrs. Clipstone's." "Why Mrs. Clipstone's?" I asked. "What's she got to do with it?" "Mrs. Clipstone delivers everyone's pheasants," my father said. "Haven't I told you that?" "No, Dad, you haven't," I said, aghast. Mrs. Grace Clipstone was the wife of the Reverend Lionel Clipstone, the local vicar. "Always choose a respectable woman to deliver your pheasants," my father announced. "That's correct, Charlie, isn't it?" "Mrs. Clipstone's a right smart lady," Charlie said. "The vicar is very fond of roasted pheasant for his dinner," my father said. "Oh, isn't?" Charlie Kinch said. We were driving through the village now, and the street lamps were lit, and the men were wandering home from the pubs, all full of beer. You know something, Danny? We've done these birds a great kindness putting them to sleep in this nice, painless way. They'd have had a nasty time of it tomorrow if we hadn't got them first. Rotten shots, most of them fellows are, Charlie Kinch said. At least half the birds finish up winged and wounded. The taxi turned left and swung in through the gates of the vicarage. There were no lights in the house, and nobody met us. My father and I got out and dumped the pheasants in the coal shed at the rear. Then we said goodbye to Charlie Kinch and began to walk the 2 miles back to the filling station. Soon we had left the village behind us and were in open country. I can't believe it, my father kept saying. I simply cannot believe we pulled it off. My heart is still thumping. So's mine, so's mine. But oh, Danny, didn't we have a glorious time? I looked at my father. His face was alight with happiness. Roasted pheasant, he cried out, addressing the moon and the entire countryside. The finest and most succulent dish on earth. I don't suppose you've ever eaten roasted pheasant, have you, Danny? Never? You wait. Does it have to be roasted, Dad? Of course it has to be roasted. You don't ever boil a young bird. Why'd you ask that? I was wondering how we do the roasting. Don't you have to have an oven or something? Of course. But we don't have an oven, Dad. All we got is a paraffin burner. I know, and that is why I have decided to buy an oven. Buy one? Yes, Danny. With such a great and glorious stock of pheasants on our hands, it is important that we have the proper equipment. Therefore, we shall go back into the village tomorrow morning and we shall buy an electric oven. We can get one at Wheeler's, and we put it in the workshop. We got plenty of electric plugs in the workshop. Won't it be very expensive? No expense is too great for roasted pheasant, my father announced superbly. And there are 3 things you must always have with roasted pheasant. Bread sauce, chipped potatoes, and boiled parsnips. There was half a minute's silence as we both allowed ourselves the pleasure of dreaming about these beautiful foods. And I'll tell you what else we've got to get, my father said. We've got to get one of those deep freezers, where you can store things for months and months, and they never go rotten. Dad, no. But don't you realize, Danny, that even after we've given birds away to all our friends, to Charlie Kinch and the Reverend Clipstone and Doc Spencer and Enoch Samways and all the rest of them, there'll still be about 50 left for us. That is why we're going to need a deep freezer. But it'll cost the earth. And worth every penny of it. A barn owl flew across the road in front of us, its great white wings waving slowly in the moonlight. Did your mum have an oven in the kitchen, Dad, when you were a boy? She had something better than an oven. It was called a cooker. It was a great big long black thing, and we used to stoke it up with coal and keep it going for 24 hours a day. And if we didn't have any coal, we used bits of wood. Could you roast pheasants in it? You could roast anything in it. It was a lovely thing, that old cooker. It used to keep the whole house warm in the winter. But you never had a cooker of your own, did you, Dad? You and Mum, when you got married? Or an oven? No, you couldn't afford things like that. Then how did you roast your pheasants? That was quite a trick. We used to build a fire outside the caravan and roast them on a spit, the way the gypsies do. What's a spit? I asked. It's just a long metal spike, and you stick it through the pheasant and put it over the fire and keep turning it round. Did it roast them well? Fairly well, he said, but an oven would do it better. Listen, Danny, Mr. Wheeler has all sorts of marvellous ovens in his shop now. He's got one in there with so many dials and knobs on it, it looks like the cockpit of an aeroplane. Is that the one you want to buy, Dad? I don't know. We'll decide tomorrow. At 8:30 the next morning, my father went into the workshop and dialed Doc Spencer's number on the telephone. Now, listen, Doctor. If you could be here at the filling station in about half an hour, I think I might have a little surprise present for you. The doctor said something in reply, and my father replaced the receiver. At 9 o'clock, Doc Spencer arrived in his car. My father went over to him and the two of them held a whispered conversation beside the pumps. Suddenly, the tiny doctor clapped his hands together and sprang up high in the air, hooting with laughter. "You don't mean it," he cried. "It's not possible." He then rushed over to me and grasped my hand in his. "I too congratulate you, my dear boy. What a triumph! What a victory! Now, why on earth didn't I think of that method myself? You're a genius, sir. Hail to thee, dear Danny. You're the champion of the world." "Here she comes," my father called out, pointing down the road. "Here she comes, Doctor." "Here who comes?" the doctor said. "Mrs. Clipstone." He spoke the name proudly, as though he were a commander referring to his bravest officer. The three of us stood together beside the pumps, looking down the road. "Can you see her?" my father asked. Far away in the distance, I could just make out a small figure advancing towards us. "What's she pushing, Dad?" My father gave me a sly look. "There's only one way of delivering pheasants safely," he said, "and that's under a baby. Isn't that right, Doctor?" "Under a baby?" Doc Spencer said. "Of course. In a pram with the baby on top." "Fantastic," the doctor said. "My old dad thought that one up many years ago," my father said, "and it's never been known to fail yet." "It's brilliant," Doc Spencer said. I could just make out the small dot of a baby sitting high up in the pram, which had its hood folded down. "There's more than 100 pheasants under that little nipper," my father said happily. "Just imagine it." "You can't put 100 pheasants into a child's perambulator," Doc Spencer said. "Don't be ridiculous." "You can if it's been specially made for the job," my father said. "This one is built extra long and extra wide, and it's got an extra deep well underneath. Listen, you could push a cow around in there if you wanted to, let alone 100 pheasants and a baby." "Did you make it yourself, Dad?" "More or less, Danny. You remember when I walked you to school and then went off to buy the raisins?" "The day before yesterday," I said. "Yes. And after that I went straight on to the vicarage and converted their pram into this. Special extra-large poacher's model. It's a beauty, really it is." "Where does the baby sit?" the doctor asked. "On top, of course," my father said. "All you need is a sheet to cover them, and the baby sits on the sheet. A bunch of pheasants makes a nice soft mattress for any child." We stood beside the pumps, waiting for Mrs. Clipstone to arrive. It was the 1st of October, and one of those warm, windless autumn mornings with a darkening sky and a smell of thunder in the air. What was so marvellous about my father, I thought, was the way he always surprised you. It was impossible to be with him for long without being surprised and astounded by one thing or another. "Right through the village, pulled as brass," my father said. "Good for her." "She seems in an awful hurry, Dad. She's sort of half running." "I imagine she's just a bit anxious to unload her cargo," the doctor said. My father squinted down the road at the approaching figure. "She does appear to be going a bit quick, doesn't she?" he said carefully. "She's going very quick," I said. There was a pause. My father was beginning to stare hard at the lady in the distance. "She's running!" Doc Spencer cried. "Look!" It was true. Mrs. Clipstone had suddenly broken into a full sprint. My father stood very still, staring at her. And in the silence that followed, I fancied I could hear a baby screaming. "What's up, Dad?" He didn't reply. "There's something wrong with that baby," Doc Spencer said. "Listen." At this point, Mrs. Clipstone was about 200 yards away from us, but closing fast. "Can you hear him now, Dad?" "Yes, I can hear him." "He's yelling his head off," Doc Spencer said. "He's having a fit," my father said. Doc Spencer didn't say anything. "If it isn't a fit," my father said, "you can bet your life it's something like it." "I doubt it's a fit," the doctor said. "Whatever it is," my father said, "I wish to heaven she'd stop running. It'll give the game away." A long lorry loaded with bricks came up behind the pram, and the driver slowed down and poked his head out of the window to stare. Mrs. Clipstone ignored him and flew on. She was so close now I could see her big red face with the mouth wide open, panting for breath. I noticed she was wearing white gloves on her hands, very prim and dainty. And there was a funny little white hat to match, perched right on the top of her head like a mushroom. Suddenly, out of the pram, straight up into the air, flew an enormous pheasant. My father let out a cry of horror. The fool in the lorry began roaring with laughter. The pheasant flapped around drunkenly for a few seconds, then lost height and landed on the grass by the side of the road. "Crikey," Doc Spencer said. "Look at that." A grocer's van came up behind the lorry and began hooting to get by. Mrs. Clipstone kept on running. Then, whoosh, a second pheasant flew up out of the pram. Then a third, and a fourth. "Great Scott," Doc Spencer said. "I know what's happened. It's the sleeping pills they're wearing off." My father didn't say a word. Mrs. Clipstone covered the last 50 yards at a tremendous pace. She came swinging into the filling station with birds flying out of the pram in all directions. "What on earth is happening?" she shrieked. She seized the screaming infant in her arms and dragged him clear. With the weight of the child suddenly lifted away, a great cloud of pheasants rose up out of the gigantic pram. There must have been well over 100 of them, and the whole sky above us was filled with huge brown birds clapping their wings. "A sleeping pill doesn't last forever," Doc Spencer said, shaking his head sadly. "It always wears off by the next morning." The pheasants were too dopey to fly far. In a few seconds, down they came again and settled themselves like a swarm of locusts all over the filling station. The place was covered with them. My father stayed remarkably calm, but not poor Mrs. Clipstone. "They nearly pecked him to pieces," she was crying, clasping the screaming baby to her bosom. "Take him into the caravan, Mrs. Clipstone," my father said. "All these birds are making him nervous. And, Danny, push that pram into the workshop, quick." Mrs. Clipstone disappeared into our caravan with the baby. I pushed the pram into the workshop. Across the road, a line of cars had already started forming behind the brick lorry and the grocery van. People were opening their doors and getting out and beginning to cross over to stare at the pheasants. "Watch out, Dad," I said. "Look who's here." The big, shiny silver Rolls-Royce had braked suddenly and come to a stop right alongside the filling station. Behind the wheel, I could see the enormous pink, beery face of Mr. Victor Hazel staring at the pheasants. I could see the mouth hanging open, the eyes bulging out of his head like toadstools, and the skin of his face turning from pink to bright scarlet. The car door opened, and out he came, resplendent in fawn-coloured riding breeches and high-polished boots. There was a yellow silk scarf with red dots on it round his neck, and he had a sort of bowler hat on his head. The great shooting party was about to begin, and he was on his way to greet the guests. He left the door of the Rolls open, and came over to us like a charging bull. My father, Doc Spencer, and I stood close together in a little group waiting for him. He started shouting at us the moment he got out of the car, and he went on shouting for a long time after that. I'm sure you'd like to know what he said, but I cannot possibly repeat it here. The language he used was so foul and filthy, it scorched my earholes. I glanced at my father. He was standing very still and very calm, waiting for the shouting to finish. The colour was back in his cheeks now, and I could see the tiny twinkling wrinkles of a smile around the corners of his eyes. "But they're not your pheasants," my father said at last. "They're mine." "Don't lie to me, man," yelled Mr. Hazel. "I'm the only person round here who has pheasants." "They're on my land," my father said quietly. "They flew onto my land, and so long as they stay on my land, they belong to me. Don't you know the rules, you bloated old blue-faced baboon?" Doc Spencer started to giggle. Mr. Hazel's skin turned from scarlet to purple. Then he glared at the dopey pheasants swarming all over the filling station. "What's the matter with them?" he shouted. "What have you done to them?" At this point, pedalling grandly towards us on his black bicycle, came the arm of the law, in the shape of Sergeant Enoch Samways, resplendent in his blue uniform and shiny silver buttons. We all saw him coming now, and a little hush fell upon the entire company. Sergeant Samways dismounted from his bicycle and threaded his way carefully through the mass of pheasants squatting on the ground. The face behind the big black moustache showed no surprise, no anger, no emotion of any kind. It was calm and neutral, as the face of the law should always be. "Well, well, well," said Sergeant Samways at last, puffing out his chest and addressing nobody in particular. "What, may I ask, is happening around here?" "I'll tell you what's happening around here," shouted Mr. Hazel, advancing upon the policeman. "These are my pheasants, and this rogue," pointing at my father, "has enticed them out of my woods onto his filthy little filling station." "Enticed?" said Sergeant Samways, looking first at Mr. Hazel, then at us. "Well, no," said the sergeant, propping his bicycle carefully against one of our pumps. I ain't never heard of nobody enticing a pheasant across 6 miles of fields and open countryside. How do you think this enticing was performed, Mr. Hazel, if I may ask? Don't ask me how he did it, 'cause I don't know, shouted Mr. Hazel. But he's done it all right. The proof is all round you. All my finest birds are sitting here in this dirty little filling station when they ought to be up in my own wood getting ready for the shoot. The words poured out of Mr. Hazel's mouth like hot lava from an erupting volcano. Am I correct, said Sergeant Samways? Am I absolutely accurate in thinking that today is the day of your great shooting party, Mr. Hazel? That's the whole point, cried Mr. Hazel, stabbing his forefinger into the sergeant's chest as though he were punching a typewriter or an adding machine. And if I don't get these birds back on my land quick sharp, some very important people are going to be extremely angry this morning. And one of my guests, I'll have you know, Sergeant, is none other than your own boss, the Chief Constable of the county. So you'd better do something about it fast, hadn't you, unless you want to lose those sergeant's stripes of yours. Sergeant Samways did not like people poking their fingers in his chest, and he showed it by twitching his upper lip so violently that his moustache came alive and jumped about like some small bristly animal. Now, just 1 minute, said Mr. Hazel. Just 1 minute, please. Am I to understand that you are accusing this gentleman here of committing this act? Of course I am, cried Mr. Hazel. I know he did it. And do you have any evidence to support this accusation? The evidence is all around you, shouted Mr. Hazel. Are you blind or something? Now my father stepped forward and fixed Mr. Hazel with his marvellous bright twinkly eyes. Surely you know how these pheasants came here, he said softly. Surely I do not know how they came here, snapped Mr. Hazel. Then I shall tell you, my father said. They all knew they were going to be shot today if they stayed in your wood, so they flew in here to wait until the shooting was over. Rubbish, yelled Mr. Hazel. It's not rubbish at all, my father said. They are extremely intelligent birds, pheasants. Isn't that so, Doctor? They have tremendous brain power, Doc Spencer said. It would undoubtedly be a great honour, my father said, to be shot by the Chief Constable of the county, and an even greater one to be eaten afterwards by Lord Thistlethwaite, but I do not think a pheasant would see it that way. You're scoundrels, both of you, shouted Mr. Hazel. You are rapscallions of the worst kind. Now then, said Sergeant Samways. Insults ain't going to get us nowhere. Therefore, gentlemen, I have a suggestion to put before you. I suggest that we all of us make a big effort to drive these birds back over the road onto Mr. Hazel's land. How does that strike you, Mr. Hazel? It'll be a step in the right direction, Mr. Hazel said. Get on with it, then. How about you, Willem? The sergeant said to my father. Are you agreeable to this action? I think it's a splendid idea, my father said, giving Sergeant Samways one of his funny looks. I'd be very glad to help. So will Danny. What's he up to now, I wondered? Because whenever my father gave someone one of his funny looks, it meant something funny was going to happen. And Sergeant Samways, I noticed, also had quite a sparkle in his usually stern eye. Come on, my lads, he cried. Let's push these lazy birds over the road. And with that, he began striding around the filling station, waving his arms at the pheasants and shouting, Shoo! Shoo! Off you go! Beat it! Get out of here! My father and I joined him in this rather absurd exercise, and for the second time that morning clouds of pheasants rose up into the air, flapping their enormous wings. It was then that I realized that in order to fly across the road, the birds would first have to fly over Mr. Hazel's mighty Rolls-Royce, which lay right in their path, with its door still open. Most of the pheasants were too dopey to manage this, so down they came again, smack on top of the great silver car. They were all over the roof and the bonnet, sliding and slithering and trying to keep a grip on that beautifully polished surface. I could hear their sharp claws scraping into the paintwork as they struggled to hang on, and already they were depositing their dirty droppings all over the roof. Get them off! Screamed Mr. Hazel. Get them away! Don't you worry, Mr. Hazel, sir, Sergeant Samways cried out. We'll fix them for you. Come on, boys. Easy does it. Shoo 'em right over the road. Not on my car, you idiot! Mr. Hazel bellowed, jumping up and down. Send them the other way. We will, sir, we will, answered Sergeant Samways. In less than a minute, the rolls was literally festooned with pheasants, all scratching and scrabbling and making their disgusting runny messes over the shiny silver paint. What is more, I saw at least a dozen of them fly right inside the car through the open door by the driver's seat. "Get those birds off my car!" Mr. Hazel bellowed. "Can't you see they're ruining the paintwork, you madman?" "Paintwork?" Sergeant Samways said. "What paintwork?" He'd stopped chasing the pheasants now, and he stood there looking at Mr. Hazel and shaking his head sadly from side to side. "We've done our very best to encourage these birds over the road," he said, "but they're too ignorant to understand." "My car, man!" shouted Mr. Hazel. "Get them away from my car!" "Ah," the sergeant said. "Your car. Yes, I see what you mean, sir. Beastly dirty birds, pheasants are. But why don't you just hop in quick and drive her away fast? They'll have to get off then, won't they?" Mr. Hazel, who seemed only too glad of an excuse to escape from this madhouse, made a dash for the open door of the rolls and leapt into the driver's seat. The moment he was in, Sergeant Samways slammed the door, and suddenly there was the most infernal uproar inside the car as a dozen or more enormous pheasants started squawking and flapping all over the seats and round Mr. Hazel's head. "Drive on, Mr. Hazel, sir," shouted Sergeant Samways through the window in his most commanding policeman's voice. "Hurry up, hurry up, hurry up, get going quick. There's no time to lose. Ignore them pheasants, Mr. Hazel, and accelerate that engine." Mr. Hazel didn't have much choice. He had to make a run for it now. He started the engine, and the great rolls shot off down the road with clouds of pheasants rising up from it in all directions. Then an extraordinary thing happened. The pheasants that had flown up off the car stayed up in the air. They didn't come flapping drunkenly down as we'd expected them to. They stayed up, and they kept on flying. Over the top of the filling station they flew, and over the caravan, and over the field at the back where our little outdoor lavatory stood, and over the next field, and over the crest of the hill, until they disappeared from sight. "Great Scott!" Doc Spencer cried. "Just look at that! They've recovered! The sleeping pills have worn off at last!" Now all the other pheasants around the place were beginning to come awake. One or two of them started running about. Then all the others started running, and when Sergeant Samways flapped his arms at them, the whole lot took off into the air and flew over the filling station and were gone. Suddenly, there was not a pheasant left. And it was very interesting to see that none of them had flown across the road, or even down the road in the direction of Hazel's Wood and the great shooting party. Every one of them had flown in exactly the opposite direction. Out on the road, a line of about 20 cars and lorries was parked bumper to bumper, and the people were standing about in groups, laughing and talking about the astonishing sight they'd just witnessed. "Come along now," Sergeant Samways called, striding towards them. "Get going, get moving, we can't have this. You're blocking the highway." Nobody ever disobeyed Sergeant Samways, and soon the people were drifting back to their cars and getting in. In a few minutes, they too were all gone. Only the four of us were left now. Doc Spencer, Sergeant Samways, my father, and me. "Well, Willem," Sergeant Samways said, coming back from the road to join us beside the pumps, "them pheasants was the most astonishing sight I ever seed in my entire life." "It was lovely," Doc Spencer said. "Just lovely. Didn't you enjoy it, Danny?" "Marvellous," I said. "But how in heaven's name did you catch him in the first place?" asked Sergeant Samways. "How did you do it, Willem? Come on, man. Let me in on the secret." My father told him. He kept it short, but even then it made a fine story. And all the way through it, the sergeant kept saying, "Well, I never. Well, I be blowed. Stone the crows," and things like that. And when the story was finished, he pointed his long policeman's finger straight at my face and cried, "Well, I'll be jiggered. I never would have thought a little nipper like you could come up with such a fantastical brainwave as that. Young man, I congratulate you." "He'll go a long way, young Danny will. You'll see if he doesn't," Doc Spencer said. "He'll be a great inventor one day." To be spoken about like that by the two men I admired most in the world, after my father, made me blush and stutter. "Well, thank goodness that's over at last," a woman's voice behind me cried out. This, of course, was Mrs. Grace Clipstone, who was now picking her way cautiously down the caravan steps with young baby Christopher in her arms. "What a gathering," she said, advancing towards us.
What a gathering we have here of rogues and varmints. Good morning, Enoch.
Good morning, Mrs. Clipstone, Sergeant Samways said. How's the baby? My father asked her. The baby is better, thank you, William, though I doubt he'll ever be quite the same again. Sergeant Samways was fetching his bicycle from beside the pumps. Well, ladies and gents, I must be off and see who else is getting into mischief round here. I'm truly sorry you were troubled, Enoch, my father said, and thanks very much indeed for your help. I wouldn't have missed this one for all the tea in China, Sergeant Samways said. But it did sadden me most terrible, Willem, to see all those lovely birds go slipping right through our fingers like that. Because to my mind, there doesn't exist a more luscious dish than roasted pheasant anywhere on this earth.
It's going to sadden the vicar a lot more than it saddens you, said Mrs. Clipstone. That's all he's been talking about ever since he got out of bed this morning.
He'll get over it, Doc Spencer said.
He will not get over it, and it's a rotten shame, Mrs. Clipstone said, because now all I've got to give him are some awful frozen fillets of cod. And he never did like cod anyway.
But, my father said, surely you didn't load all those pheasants into the pram, did you? You were meant to keep at least a dozen for you and the vicar.
Oh, I know that, she wailed, but I was so tickled at the thought of strolling calmly through the village with Christopher sitting on 120 birds, I simply forgot to keep any back for ourselves. And now, alas, they're all gone, and so is the vicar's supper. The doctor went over to Mrs. Clipstone and took her by the arm. You come with me, Grace, he said. I've got something to show you. He led her across to my father's workshop, where the big doors stood wide open. The rest of us stayed where we were and waited. Good grief, come and look at this, Mrs. Clipstone called from inside the workshop. William, Enoch, Danny, come and look. We hurried over and entered the workshop. It was a great sight. Laid out on my father's bench, amid the spanners and wrenches and oily rags, were 6 magnificent pheasants, 3 cocks and 3 hens. There we are, ladies and gentlemen, said the doctor, his small wrinkled face beaming with delight. How's that? We were speechless. 2 for you, Grace, to keep the vicar in a good mood, Doc Spencer said. 2 for Enoch for all the fine work he did this morning. And 2 for William and Danny, who deserve them most of all. What about you, Doctor? My father asked. That doesn't leave any for you. My wife has enough to do without plucking pheasants all day long, he said. But how on earth did you get them? My father asked him. When did you nab them? I didn't nab them, the doctor said. I had a hunch. What sort of a hunch? My father asked. It seemed fairly obvious, the doctor said, that some of those pheasants must have gobbled up more than 1 raisin each. Some, if they were quick enough, might have swallowed half a dozen each, or even more, in which case they would have received a very heavy overdose of sleeping pills and wouldn't ever wake up. Aha, we cried. Of course, of course. So, while you were also busy driving the birds onto old Hazel's Rolls-Royce, I sneaked in here and had a look under the sheet in the bottom of the pram. And there they were. I am very much obliged to you, Doctor, Sergeant Samways said. I really am. It was all over now. My father and I stood alone just outside the workshop, and suddenly the old place seemed to become very quiet. Well, Danny, my father said, looking at me with those twinkly eyes of his, that's that. It was fun, Dad. I know it was. I really loved it. So did I, Danny. Maybe we should lock the pumps and take a holiday for the rest of the day. You mean not open up at all? Why should we? After all, it's Saturday, isn't it? But we always stay open on Saturdays, Dad. And Sundays. Maybe it's time we didn't. We could do something else instead. Something more interesting. I waited, wondering what was coming next. When we reached the caravan, my father climbed the steps and sat down on the little outside platform. I climbed up and sat down beside him, with my feet on the steps of the ladder. I know a place about 3 miles away, my father was saying, over Cobbler's Hill and down the other side, where there's a small wood of larch trees. It's a very quiet place, and the stream runs right through it. The stream, I said. He nodded and gave me another of his twinkly looks. It's full of trout. Oh, could we?
Could we go there, Dad? Why not? We could try tickling them, the way Doc Spencer told us. Will you teach me? I said. I haven't had much practice with trout. Pheasants are more in my line. But we could always learn. Can we go now? I asked, getting excited all over again. I thought we would just pop into the village first and buy the electric oven. You haven't forgotten about the electric oven, have you? But, Dad, that was when we thought we were going to have lots and lots of pheasants to roast. We still got the 2 the Doc gave us. And with any luck, we'll have lots of them as the weeks go by. It's time we had an oven anyway. We could have roasted pork one day, and then if we felt like it, we could have roasted leg of lamb the next time, or even roasted beef. Wouldn't you like that? Yes, of course I would. And, Dad, would you be able to make your favourite thing of all? What's that? Toad in the hole, I said. By golly, he cried. That'll be the very first thing we'll make in our new oven. Can we get it today, Dad? Will they deliver it at once? They might, Danny. We'll have to see. We must go personally to see Mr. Wheeler, and we must inspect all the different models with great care. All right, I said, let's go. I was really steamed up now about getting an oven and being able to have toad in the hole and roasted pork and stuff like that. I couldn't wait. My father got to his feet. And when we've done that, we'll go off to the stream and see if we can't find us some big rainbow trout. A few minutes later, the 2 of us were walking down the well-known road towards the village to buy the oven. My father's iron foot went clink, clink on the hard surface, and overhead some big black thunderclouds were moving slowly down the valley. Dad? Yes, my love? When we have our roasted pheasant supper with our new oven, do you think we could invite Dr. Spencer and Mrs. Spencer to eat it with us? Great heavens, my father cried. What a wonderful thought. What a beautiful idea. We'll give a dinner party in their honour. The only thing is, I said, will there be enough room in the caravan for 4 people? I think so, just. But we've only got 2 chairs. That's no problem, Danny. You and I can sit on boxes. There was a short silence. Then he said, but I'll tell you what we must have, and that's a tablecloth. We can't serve dinner to the doctor and his wife without a tablecloth. But we don't have a tablecloth, Dad. Don't you worry about it. We can use a sheet from one of the bunks. That's all a tablecloth is, sort of sheet. What about knives and forks? How many do we have? Just 2 knives, I said, and 2 forks, and those are all a bit dented. We shall buy 2 more of each, my father said. We shall give our guests the new ones, and use the old ones ourselves. Good, I said. Lovely. I reached out and slid my hand into his. He folded his long fingers round my fist and held it tight. And we walked on towards the village, where soon the 2 of us would be inspecting all the different ovens with great care and talking to Mr. Wheeler personally about them. And after that, we would walk home again and make up some sandwiches for our lunch. And after that, we would set off with the sandwiches in our pockets, striding up over Cobbler's Hill and down the other side to the small wood of larch trees with the stream running through it. And after that, perhaps a big rainbow trout. And after that, there would be something else after that. And after that. Ah, yes, and something else again. Because what I'm trying to tell you, what I've been trying so hard to tell you all along, is simply that my father, without the slightest doubt, was the most marvellous and exciting father any boy ever had. A message to children who have read this book. When you grow up and have children of your own, do please remember something important. A stodgy parent is no fun at all. What a child wants and deserves is a parent who is sparky.